Hello, I'm John Murphy. I'm Senior Vice President for International Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. She's well known to this audience. Dr. Ngozi is the 7th Director General of the World Trade Organization. She took office on March 1st last year, becoming the first African to serve as Director General. She's also the first U.S. citizen to serve in the role, so we're happy to claim her a little bit as well. Earlier, she served twice as Nigeria's finance minister, and she had a 25-year career at the World Bank as an economist, rising to the organization's #2 position. She more recently served as chair of the board of Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. Dr. Ngozi, welcome.
Thank you, John.
Before we turn to the World Trade Organization, let's talk about world trade just for a moment. It seems like we open the newspapers every day and see columns written about how globalization is dead. And yet international trade flows just seem to grow and grow. And nonetheless, it's clear that international trade is under stress. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has interrupted a great deal of trade in agricultural products, metals, energy. And also before that invasion, there was a great deal of stress between the US and China and talk about decoupling. So welcome your sense of this. What is the trajectory of world trade today?
Well, thank you, John. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that there's now, heightened talk about the trajectory of world trade, going into 2 or 3 blocks, a fractured and fragmented trade system, the coupling, as you mentioned, and the skepticism about globalization. That had actually started even before the pandemic. People had started talking about deglobalization. I think the pandemic and the war in Ukraine have just accelerated and heightened this feeling that the multilateral trading system and multilateralism as a whole is in trouble and can no longer deliver. However, there's also what you said, which is that if you look at the actual numbers of trade flows, you will see that what's happening on the ground doesn't speak to, the multilateral trading system not working. If you just look at the flows between China and the US, which is, where the rhetoric and the tension is fraught. You have US exports, I think last year to China were at about $153 billion. And China's exports to the US were maybe 4 times that. So I'm getting to the peak where they were the year before. So the actual trade going on between countries is quite robust. And does not sometimes match with the rhetoric. So that's the first point I want to make, that business people, consumers, seem to be doing something somewhat different from what politicians are saying. I think the second point I'd like to make is that we should be very careful. Yes, globalization it's lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty. It's brought prosperity over time, but we know that there are people who have been left behind. Poor people within rich countries and poor countries who did not benefit. That being said, I don't think this is the time to now talk about fragmentation and walking away. Actually, I think this is the time to invest in the multilateral trading system. As I've termed it, it's a global public good that was born 77 years ago, nurtured over time. It has delivered, it has problems. Let's invest in it and make it better, not walking away. The third and last point I'll make on this issue is that WTO economists have actually looked at what it would cost if the world were to break into 2 trading blocks. And they found that, longer term real GDP would decline by about 5% if this were to happen. So there are costs to fragmentation. There are costs to blocks, and we should not minimize those, and we should really reflect.
Well, thank you very much for that. I'll just add the U.S. Chamber commissioned a study of what decoupling would cost as well, and also came up with some very large and alarming numbers. So thank you for that. I wonder if we could touch on supply chains, which is, something that most people never talked about until recent years, but now it seems that we talk about it over the dinner table. It seems that we're at an inflection point with supply chain problems that in much of the world, the problem was a huge surge in demand, which caused trade to grow much more than anticipated and left our ports clogged. And now, though, in 2022, we have supply side interruptions. So we're going perhaps from a demand problem to a supply side problem where grain can't get out of Russia and Ukraine, or the COVID lockdowns in China may be interrupting this. What does the WTO have to offer when it comes to the supply chain issue?
Well, I think, two things. We tried to understand a little bit better, because one of the questions we get from different kinds of the financial sector, for instance, central bank governors who are worried about whether this is a structural problem and will continue to cause inflationary pressures from different business groups is this going to last very long? Are we going to see the end of this? And initially, when it was a supply-demand mismatch, particularly with respect to what is happening in the United States and the fiscal stimulus that was given during the pandemic, which led to the overwhelming demand, we thought maybe this will, phase out once supply comes back into stream. And once the effect of the fiscal stimulus goes down, demand will go down. And some of that actually began to happen before the war in Russia came in. But at the same time, we started asking ourselves, we're getting all these questions, maybe we better try and understand whether there are other issues, structural issues that may be lying behind this, that may mean things may not work out quite as quickly as we thought. And we did have about a month ago a supply chain conference where we brought logistics port operators, we brought businesses like IKEA, we brought small and medium enterprises, we brought shipping companies, Maersk, CMC, CMG, the big guys. And we wanted to understand from them, and what we understood really is that there are some difficult problems that need to be solved if supply chains are to work themselves out. So quite apart from the COVID and the 500 ships in a line in Shanghai, who cannot offload, and the lockdowns from the pandemic, you've got issues of labor, for instance. Now, that seems to be easing a little bit, but there were a lot of complaints from shipping companies and logistics operators that we get our goods there and then there are no trucks, no truck drivers to drive trucks. We don't even know whether they'll be there, so we end up, waiting. Warehouse space, they complained this wasn't sufficient. Even some of the port operators said their ports needed work in order to fit with the new kinds of ships that are being built. So there are some of these logistical and structural problems that will need a little bit of time to work out, and they still kind of affects of the way that supply chain logistics work. And then you've got the war in Ukraine, and you've got what that has done to the Black Sea and the blockage there. So you just have a piling on of some of these issues. And I think it will take us some time to be able to work that out. Now, specifically, what has the WTO been doing? Apart from understanding and trying to work with these companies on what we can do to help them, we've worked with specific sectors or industries like vaccine manufacturers who are experiencing supply chain issues. Some of them have to come from export restrictions and prohibitions that stop them getting their inputs to where they need them for production. Some of them are restrictions on outputs. And we've been able, meeting with the CEOs every 6 weeks, looking at their supply chain problems, at their raw materials problems, and trying to work with our members to make sure that these restrictions are lifted, for instance, and that they don't form an impediment. And that has worked really well. We've gone from 119 export restrictions at the beginning of the pandemic down to about 35 a few weeks ago. And then we have trade facilitation measures. We have the trade facilitation agreement, and getting our members to work more on facilitating trade, implementing this agreement is really very popular with business. So on those two ends, we've also been working to make sure supply chains are assisted as much as possible.
Well, thank you for that work. In particular, the work on export restrictions, I think, is something the business community really values, whether it's with vaccine inputs or today in agricultural products, where the spread of export restrictions can greatly exacerbate the problem of global hunger. Changing topics a bit here, I wanted to raise the TRIPS waiver debate, this idea that suspending intellectual property protections for vaccines might help their production. And Dr. Ngozi, as you know, we at the U.S. Chamber don't think that that's a good idea. We're quite convinced that intellectual property protections have actually accelerated the creation of these vaccines. We've had something like 12 billion doses administered. There's another 9 billion expected. And many countries around the world seem to be swimming in vaccine doses that are not being used. I wonder if you could, share your thoughts at this moment in time, not relitigating the entire issue, but isn't there a growing sense that this is the idea of a TRIPS waiver is an idea whose time has passed, given this very widespread availability of vaccines today?
Well, thank you, John. You raised some very important issues. Let me say right off the bat that I also believe that we need to incentivize research and development, and that we must make sure that whatever we do does not disincentivize that. I strongly believe in that from my work in Gavi and so on. So that's a very important point. At the same point, you say, maybe this is now passé because we have a surplus or a strong production of vaccines now, and that is the truth. Let me just take that in two ways. One, it is good we now have that, but it's come a little bit too late for the members who were insisting on this. Expand a little bit on that, John. We went through this inequity of access period where people in poor countries were really waiting for these vaccines and felt themselves to be at the back of the queue. And it was an unfortunate period when richer countries bought up the available vaccines and the poorer countries didn't get. We pushed a lot to increase production, but it's coming at a time after waiting that people have become a bit skeptical, a bit resistant. So we have to work really hard with campaigns in order to get those jabs in arms and with distribution problems. So you're right, now we have a surplus production and we have some distribution problems and some vaccine hesitancy and apathy. All that needs work. Because if you look at it, even in Africa, it's a fraction of people vaccinated, maybe up to 20% compared to 18% in some developed countries. So we need to work. But the problem is that this came a little bit late. When and by then, policymakers and politicians in these countries had been caught without able to give service to their populations. And I think what you're seeing is this won't happen to us again. We won't be caught with our pants down, quote unquote, the next time. Just as policymakers and politicians in rich countries bought more than what their population needed, just so they would not be accused of not being ready or having enough. Now you see policymakers in those poor countries saying, no, we're going to insist on having a way to have access, so that next time around, or if this wave continues, we can manufacture. And you know that the concentration of manufacturing is quite intense. 10 countries export 80% of the vaccines in the world. So all these things are on the table. Now, we still have those 100 and something countries at the WTO insisting on a TRIPS waiver, just as we have those, including business, those who have strong business and pharma manufacturing, insisting this is not the case, we should not have the waiver. To try and break this impasse, because those 100 and something members are not going away, we try to find a medium ground, a compromise, working with 4 countries who said, okay, we'll agree to have discussions with each other informally to see if we can come up with some ideas. And what they have come up with is within the framework of the TRIPS agreement. So it's not something outside the framework. So it does give some protections, but at the same time allows access so that developing countries will be able, to have that access to manufacture without, in my belief, if you look at the agreement strongly, without disincentivizing research and production. So this is, of course, the nature of a compromise is that both sides, neither of them really like it. The business community and the countries where they work would like to have nothing done. The TRIPS waiver people feel this is not what we're asking for. So I think both should really look at it and see that this is a reasonable, workable compromise for both sides. That's what I think. And we're debating it now at the WTO. We'll see if members can finally come up with that workable solution.
Well, thank you. I think that there is a sense in the business community that there's a willingness to support this issue of equity and make additional investments in distribution and getting shots into arms. And that's something where I think governments around the world, developing governments, the United States and others, really could have done more and can still do more. So we'll stay engaged on that. One last question for you. Of course, we're just a month out from MC12, from the Ministerial Conference. What's your sense of what can be accomplished here? I know there's talks on many fronts. We've followed, just to give one example, the fishery subsidy negotiations. It's very frustrating. This has gone on for years. That's an example of an area where an agreement could accomplish a great deal to prevent overfishing around the world. What's your sense of what can be accomplished?
Well, John, let me say one thing. I share your frustration at the length of time it takes. It shouldn't take this long to negotiate agreements. Fisheries, agriculture, they've taken more than 20 years. So we were quite hopeful coming into the ministerial in November. If you recall, we were going to hold it in November until Omicron came out and we had to postpone. Then we were hopeful of being able to deliver several things. Now the war in Ukraine has had an impact. And it's happening in other multilateral fora, where it's a little bit difficult for those countries who are against this, saying that it's difficult for them to work or be in the room with maybe the delegation of Russia and so on. And now we negotiate. So if that's the case, negotiating may not be easy. So how do we deal with that to make sure we still have some sensible deliverables at FC12? We are trying to work hard before. I'm saying to our members, and so is the General Council Chair, that we need to work hard now, because if the ministers cannot negotiate, let's take that as the worst case scenario. We don't want to wait until we get to MC12 and then find out they can't complete the package. So the strategy is to try to work on food security issues now. We hope to have something on that. Response to the pandemic, we just spoke a little bit about that, including issues of transparency and export restrictions. Fisheries, to work on that. And agriculture to at least advance the negotiations, even if we can't close it. So that's a bit the approach, to try and have 1 or 2 deliverables that we finish so that ministers can bless, and then to put the others in a way that we can advance the work and agree on a work program that can then be completed at MC13. So we're still looking for 1 or 2 deliverables. It won't be as robust as it was going to be in November, given the situation we have, but we still want to come out of it with a couple of concrete things achieved.
Well, Dr. Ngozi, the U.S. business community wants you to succeed, and we want to be helpful to you in every way that we can. We need the WTO. We need the WTO to succeed and to deliver new agreements. We're also strong supporters of reform that would allow the appellate body to be restored. So there's a lot more we could cover, but I want to thank you for joining us here today and wish you every success here in the next month.
Thank you, John. Just before we close, I do want to say one quick word on WTO reform. You said that the business community is very interested in that. It's very timely, and I hope we get your support. We hope to agree on a process to implement the reforms at MC12, especially with respect to the appellate body and the dispute settlement system. And I'm happy to say that the US is engaging other members now to talk about this. So we're hopeful. You know, the WTO process is sometimes as important as substance. So we need to agree a process, and I think we can do that. Thanks very much, John. And thank you for the support of the US business community.
Well, thank you. That's good news. And we'll stay in close touch. All the best.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.